Hello everybody and welcome to this month's Specifying Practice Group call. So with that, I do want to hand it over to Dave and Lewis to get started with today's session. So Dave and Lewis, over to you.
Well, thanks, Matt. This is Dave Stutzman coming to you from southern New Jersey.
So I'm coming to you from sunny downtown Nashville, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot from David since this is basically his idea, and he's the lead AP.
Oh, well, thanks, Lewis. Now you set me up for either success or failure. I'm not sure just which, but we'll dive into this. A little background, perhaps, and this is in somewhat my own personal opinion, so you can agree or not as you choose, but we deal with quite a few projects that are seeking LEED compliance primarily. We've only ever had one Green Globes project that we're currently working on, and I don't believe we've actually worked on any other of the LEED or the other of the green performance type programs yet. So it's been primarily LEED, and the design teams, when they come to us and explain that the project is going for green, one of the first things I ask is, are we really doing this because we're trying to make a difference, or are we just doing this to gain points and get through the system? And that sometimes...
And have a nifty certificate to hang on the wall of the lobby.
Yeah, and the question sometimes surprises the architects, and I think maybe because they had never thought of it in those kinds of terms, and they don't often have an answer for that question. So
it is kind of an elephant in the room question, David.
Well, and in some cases it is, and I think in many times what the attitude and the way that the projects progress, it really is about the points and is not necessarily about an overall more lofty goal to produce something that's really sustainable or really green. So we have today we're forcing you all to participate. Let me get back here, and we've got poll questions lined up. We haven't done poll questions for quite a long time. But Matt, we want to put you to work too.
You want to go back to the first, and I'll explain the
photo.
Oh,
yes, you've got to explain the photo. Go ahead.
I was was called out to look at some things on an existing building, not one that we designed, and I noticed that in the lobby that there was the certificate that the building had been LEED certified. I forget at what level, I don't recall. But as you can see, the doors are leaking air like crazy. And I just thought that might be, I was amused, so I snapped a couple of photographs of it.
It's pretty amazing. I just am looking at and wondering where in the world is the door stop? You know, it's got to be completely missing. Okay. All right. So we have a total of 5 poll questions for you today. So be prepared. Everybody has got to participate. It doesn't take a great deal of effort. Matt, go ahead and put up the first poll question. And the poll question is loosely related to what is shown on the screen. So hopefully we'll get good participation here. Right? So I want to look at what really is driving product selection and the process. And because I think that this goes to whether or not we're actually playing the points game or we're looking for performance. So how are we doing, Matt? We've got 100% participation? No, come on, you folk. Everybody can participate. All you have to do is push the button. Okay. 70%, 75. Okay, we're getting close. You guys are going to make it to 100% yet. This is not a difficult question. All right. I think we're close enough, Matt. What do you think? Lewis, where are we on the results?
Well, it looks like it's pretty much split. When there is a 40% for no, but yes, but between 31% for yes for all projects and yes for selected projects is 29%. So that's 60%. So at least looks like 60% of our attendees have some sort of green policy for design and product selections.
Yeah, and I'm very interested in the ones that are 31% for all projects. And I've run into this recently where we actually have a client who does have a green policy which is probably more stringent than you would find under LEED. And that policy they have adopted as their standard regardless whether the owner is seeking LEED compliance or not. So it's an interesting attitude, I find, because here we're looking at an architectural policy or an architect's office policy being applied to a project and not necessarily driven by an owner requirement. And that to me is a little bit of a puzzle.
Gail Ann Goldstead points out that they have not so much a green policy as such, but rather goals. But having goals is a form of policy, but it is, it is evidence of a general commitment to some level of sustainability that I think most architects, even probably beyond that 60%, have.
So, and for those that answered for the selected projects, I would really be curious as to what is making it only selectively applicable. Is that because it's project team driven or project manager driven? Is it project type driven? I'd just be curious to know. What I would suggest, my own opinion, that this is really an owner requirement that needs to be driving this process, because we're trying to select products to be able to satisfy an owner's project requirements, to be able to meet his end game, to be able to deliver something that can perform as the owner really intends. And I think that that's something that's got to take precedence over some sort of an internal architectural office policy. Louis, you're coming out of an architectural firm, and I'm sitting here as an independent specifier. Do you have internal policies relating to green?
It's not a formal policy as such, but more, as Gail Ann said, the goal to try to get as much in as possible and to try to educate our clients about the possibilities for saving energy, especially even if we have to go to slightly more expensive materials, that we can show them that there is a return on investment. We had a couple of comments from the floor. Dave Metzger says some policy is required by a jurisdiction, and we'll talk about that later. For example, low VOC paints and sealants and so forth. And there are even some areas where they're requiring LEED certificate. Some government agencies or governmental bodies are requiring LEED certification for new construction. And John David Hutchinson says CSV Architects in Ottawa has a specification that all project materials meet the requirements of LEED MR and IAQ criteria because it's the right thing to do and is not cost prohibitive. So that's an example of a policy, an internal policy.
Yes.
Mark Schlemp says the office I work for primarily works in California, and all California falls under Cal Green. And we'll talk. David's going to tell us about that a little bit later. And Mark, we might call on you to fill in some of the gaps in his explanation. And Alan Itzkowitz says, don't we as architects have to make product selections in a sustainable way? And obviously we have a responsibility to the public and to ourselves and to the profession to make wise decisions that are in the best interest of the owner. But we do have to balance that sometimes with what the owner is willing to pay for.
Well, and I think that's a good point, that we really need to be watching out for the owner's interests, and whether it's sustainable or not, the owner may actually have a different objective than to produce something that is green, and we have to be aware of that.
We did a project some years ago as a building for the national headquarters for a large manufacturing concern, North American headquarters, and the owner set some requirements or goals for LEED certification, but when it came down to it, rather than paying the fee for the certificate to hang in the lobby, the company decided to instead take that same money and buy a partial green roof, which I thought was very commendable. We have a couple of more comments. Chris Beershank says, while transparency is important, doesn't this have to be balanced with product's performance? And that's certainly right. Elias Saltz says architects have a responsibility to provide solutions that comply with the owner's objectives and not some random idea of a greater good. That's very cogent, Elias. These are one of our stronger Twitterers. Tony Horton says, I speak for the MEPFP firms I have worked for in the past, where energy efficient design was the standard of care. However, we would give the client the good, better, and best options to choose from. And
I just want to comment on that, Tony. I think that's an excellent idea, because it seems to me as though by providing the option and explaining the benefit or explaining the cost implications with the benefits, you're informing the owner about a decision that then the owner can make in his own best interest, which is probably the best alternative. So that it is an informed owner making the decision, being part of the decision-making process. Okay, sorry to interrupt you, Louis. You were reading more, but that's okay. This is great that we have the good conversation going here.
Yeah. Steve Laundry says, haven't all architects that have accepted the 2030 challenge promised to make their projects meet this green goal? And shouldn't that be disclosed to the owners prior to hiring the architect? And yes, I certainly agree with that, Steve, that we need to tell folks that. But of course, a lot of the folks who make that promise are still designing big glass boxes
that are equivalent to what? R30, R40 exterior wall envelopes?
No, more like R3.
Okay. All right. So let's divert the discussion maybe a little bit. Matt, can you put up the second poll question? Okay. So does your office actively promote green design to building owners? This I think is going to be an interesting response, but I think it's going to be predictable. Okay, I think, and what we're trying to get to is then what really is driving some of these decisions about going green, and what is perhaps both in the back of the mind for the architects and the owners as to a decision to go green for a particular project. So we're nearly 75%. Okay. All right, Matt. I think that's close enough. 75% or 71% of you participated. We're saying 37% yes, that you're going to actively promote for all owners that they should be going with a green design. 39%, I thought this would be a little bit more lopsided. Promote it for owners expressing an interest. And 20% no, which is also maybe a point for discussion. So the fact that we have the vast majority actually promoting green design, I think, says something about the how prevalent some of the green programs are in the community and how well they've been presented to the community as a good way to approach design. It's almost been ingrained over the last, I'll say 15 years, because LEED really started to begin promoting heavily in the early 2000s. And
David,
yes.
Elias Schultz asks, what do you mean by yes only for the general community? Apparently he was a little confused, and I think probably a few other of our respondents may have been confused by what you were trying to elicit with that response.
I was trying to get to a point where, as an architect within the community, that you're going to be promoting sustainable design, but you're not actively necessarily promoting directly to owners. That it's more at a public level as opposed to a project level. So perhaps I didn't state the question very well, or the answer very well.
Let's see, we have, Scott Anderton says, as a consultant, I'm seldom able to promote much. I have to rely on my clients. Yes, and if you're an MEP engineer, you're downstream from the architect, and you may not have any direct contact with the client, or very little. Ken Hersenberg says, promoting green, many owners are receptive until VE. Often the ones who follow through are mandated by company policy or whatever.
Well, I want to say that I think, looking at the list of some of the things that might drive this decision, I think you do have the owners that are really committed to a program, to a cause, that they see it as either their way to give back to a community or their way to set themselves apart from potential competition. And I think along with that, then you have advocacy, where perhaps some of the folks that are actually promoting green design to the owners actively are falling more into that advocacy role. So the advocacy and the commitment are almost, in my mind, the same. That they're doing it necessarily for the greater good, or they see a greater good, and that's one of the primary movers to make that decision. So, what else did you have in the way of comments?
Tony Horton says, if you're a building owner, the awareness of decisions will affect the utility and maintenance costs for the life of the building. And he goes further to say the consultant, MEP, FP, often has the challenge to make the architect's glass house meet or exceed code requirements. And that can be a true challenge to Tony, and you have nothing but our sympathy on that.
And another good point, Tony, because one of the things I find really interesting when it comes to the building envelope and making that glass house meet code, when I, as a specifier, am asking the architect about the envelope performance, often they defer to the mechanical engineer to be able to make or to define what that envelope performance must be. And I find that a bit curious that the architect is passing that responsibility off when percent glass has a big effect, and being able to meet the energy codes and the overall energy performance
actually,
is drastically affected.
David, in my experience, a lot of projects, the mechanical team are just going to go ahead and make a bunch of assumptions that may or may not have anything to do with the actual design of the building envelope. That's obviously not the right way to approach it, but realistically, I think that happens more than any of us would like to admit to the outsiders.
Or do you think, though, that they're making the assumptions because they have to complete the energy model, they have to begin a preliminary design, they need some basis for beginning that design, and they're not necessarily getting direction from the owner or through the architect as to what that energy or what the performance really needs to be?
Yes, I think it says a lot about the early planning and design and schematic design, frankly, that do we know enough about the exterior walls and the roof, the building envelope, about the glazing, the wall-to-window ratio, and so forth? Are we going for code minimum, or are we going to try to go a little bit higher than code requirements? That those decisions need to be made as early in the design process as possible so that our MEP friends can make rational decisions based on those commitments.
Right, so we're talking about the performance.
Yes.
And potentially the economics, because you could have one system that does fabulous in performance but is terribly expensive. You have another one that's not quite as good in performance, much more affordable, so it becomes somewhat of a balancing act in selecting an alternative.
As Gail Ann Goldstead says, we work with our basis of design glazing manufacturer and our MEP engineers to specify glazing performance that works with the MEP basis of design, or their assumptions and concepts, because that can make a big difference. Just that, even on projects with conventional punched windows as opposed to extensive curtain wall, it can make a very big difference.
Right.
Scott Anderton says value engineering can cause real problems with efficient HVAC designs. So I think we're all agreed that the earlier we make decisions, like Tony Horton says, with stakeholders, the better.
Yep.
While we're on this slide, David, some of us are not familiar with Cal Green. I'm surprised that a New Jersey boy does work in California, but fill us in on a little bit on that, will you?
Well, Cal Green is much like the IECC, the International Energy Conservation Code, and Cal Green is California code. It's statutory. You have to comply. It does govern energy conservation. It does govern a good number of things that LEED also addresses. So it being statutory, you have to meet it, no choice, just like the IECC that has been adopted in some of the localities I know in Maryland where we're doing some other work, and you have to pay attention. It's statutory, you have no choice. One thing that we didn't touch on this slide is the marketing aspect. And we see this often from developers and sometimes commercial owners, where they perceive that there's an advantage for them to actually be able to sell space in a building if they can promote the building itself as meeting some sort of sustainability standard. So there may be that, the marketing plus the economics for them, because they may be able to command a higher rent for a particular building.
In particular, a lot of high-tech companies specifically look for properties that have those kinds of there's some, a commitment to conservation and sustainability.
Right. So I would look at this list of potential things driving the decision and try to get an answer early on in the project. What is the real concern? What are we trying to accomplish by the time we get to the end of design? Okay, Matt, we're up to question 3. If you could go ahead and open that poll. So what rating systems are you using?
Now, we might stress that these are the voluntary ones, not obviously the International Energy Conservation Code or Cal Green.
Right.
That are required by statute.
And please, when you're checking these off, check all of the ones that you're actually using so that we get a sense as to which ones might be most popular or least popular. So we're doing pretty well here. Almost 60% of you have voted.
We've had 3 or 4 hospital projects done with the Green Globes. I need to talk to those teams and see what their experience was.
Okay. All right, Matt. We're just about 70% have participated, so we're looking at LEED by far and away, LEED 2009 and LEED V4. Actually, I'm surprised at LEED V4.
I am too.
Because I will tell you that we are starting our very first LEED V4 project. And it's the only one that's even been requested to be LEED 4 that we've seen. So the number of folks using LEED V4, that is a big surprise. What are you seeing primarily?
The 2009.
Yeah, and you mentioned you've done Green Globes. We're starting our very first Green Globes as well. So, and the 10% doing Living Building Challenge. That one is truly a challenge. I applaud all of you that are actually attempting that. That's spectacular.
We had a couple of comments here. I'm sorry. Jeffrey Pelis says Energy Star is very prevalent for us, especially in HUD-funded work. And John David Hutchinson says the other that I checked was for International Passive House Standard for low-income housing projects. And Eric asked, these numbers do not add up to 100%, and that's because, Eric, these were to check as many as apply.
Right. And thanks for the comment about passive house. I should say we have done one passive house project. It was low-income housing, so it was subsidized construction. And we put the architect put the project out for bid. The bids came back, and the passive house requirements as a result were thrown out of the project, and it was built under conventional construction. They just couldn't tolerate the additional price. So it'd be, if you could tell us more about your experience about passive house, John David, that would be helpful. We'd love to share that with everybody else here. Okay, Matt, next question. We're getting pretty good participation here, don't you think, Louis?
Very. And David and I really appreciate that. We don't want to lecture. We really like the idea of being thought leaders for open discussion, and both of us learn a lot from our audience participants, and so we appreciate all the back and forth that we get with you good folks.
Yeah, so what is the most important aspect in green design?
Oh, before we go there, Ty Pham says that Washington, D.C. does not accept green globes under the D.C. Green Act.
That's interesting. I can't say that I've done work in Washington, D.C., so I don't know.
Interesting. Okay, how are the numbers coming in? We got the votes coming in?
We do. We're going to wait just a few more seconds here, see if we can get a couple
and both Scott Anderton and Robert Bowman point out that high performance can pertain to all of the categories.
Can it? That's interesting. You and I've had that little discussion.
Right, as in all of the above.
Okay. All right, Matt. I think we're close enough.
I have a very funny story to tell about high performance buildings from an ASHRAE report, but let's finish this.
Okay.
So water savings is not very important to most folks.
We must have nobody here from Arizona.
My firm is a multidiscipline firm, and we have a number of offices, probably as many offices that do water service and treatment plants or projects as architecture. Not quite as big in dollar volume, but they might disagree with this.
Well, energy savings got the most votes here for sure, and I guess that's not surprising. And high performance came in a distant second, I would say. But the thing that I think is most noticeable, you look at the materials selections and indoor air quality at 13% for materials, 7% for indoor air quality. These two, in all of the LEED projects that we are doing, are the ones that are most commonly selected. And I was telling Lewis earlier that virtually every LEED checklist that we get, I can, with probably 99% certainty, select most of the credits that will be sought for each project. And the materials and indoor air quality are the ones that are always dead on. We always know which ones they're going to go for. But with each version of LEED that's gone by, the importance of the materials selections and the indoor air quality keeps being reduced, and those credits get shifted elsewhere in the credits, primarily to water and energy.
And of course, Dave Metzger points out water savings and energy savings are the most easily quantified in terms of evaluating compliance with performance goals. And Wade Bevier says water is a very strong second with him, but he was only able to select one. And Steve Laundrie said, of course, the project location would give different answers, like you said, Arizona, but he says Saudi Arabia or home for a person with chemically sensitive person would be indoor air quality. And indeed, because my firm, our largest market area is the healthcare industry, we regularly specify zero VOC paints, and we take a great deal of care about a lot of those things that are not necessarily making points for any kind of certification, but we are concerned about their potential influence on the patients and the staff in those facilities. So those are more important on a hospital than the energy savings, which would be more important to a suburban office building developer.
Okay, so what kind of things are driving basis of design selections? I mean, I've listed the three that I think: the maximize the positive, minimize the negative, or optimize the outcome. And I'd be curious what the general.
Is that a song cue?
It could be. You know, for those of us that live in the 40s, it could be.
No. Well, come think of it, I was born in 46. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, so I find it interesting in green discussions that oftentimes the design team seems to be focusing either on maximizing a particular thing or minimizing a particular thing, where my take on how it should be approached is really in an optimization mode, because every time you adjust something, you're going to affect something else. In the case of one of our listeners here today is saying, yeah, if you if you design a high performance HVAC system, and now you go back and you adjust your building envelope, all of a sudden you have a huge impact on that HVAC system. Could be negative, could be positive, could make it smaller, could make it larger, adjust and affect the cost overall. So that you can't make these decisions about green products or green systems in a vacuum. You need to be able to understand that one decision is going to affect another, and that optimization then becomes much more important, both in the way of performance and the economics of the project.
And there's also the issue that you design the most efficient energy-saving building envelope and have the best equipment, but if the owner's operating engineer does not fully understand the system, they're not going to realize as much of the savings and conservation as is possible. And that's a real problem.
Okay, you've opened the door, Louis, and I have to take the bait.
Okay.
Okay, so this is one of my own personal agendas, and I apologize ahead of time. But if you think about what we're doing as the architectural and the design community, and even the construction community, so we're designing these buildings. Pick a number, doesn't matter. A $40 million office building. And when we hand the thing over to the owner, we're handing him a whole pile of O&M manuals for each system, for each component, but we're not handing him a facility O&M manual written specifically for that facility, so that he knows definitively how to operate it within the design parameters to meet the design criteria. We're really leaving it up to him to figure this thing out. And when we're designing high performance buildings, if we're expecting tight controls and automation to work for the owner to be able to optimize energy performance, for instance, we need to be able to educate the owner well enough that he can actually take control and manage the building and get the expected outcome.
Perhaps we could hear from, if there's a mechanical engineer in our audience would like to raise your hand and actually address that situation and give us your input on that. I would like to hear from you if there's someone here that could do that. And of course, part of it is not just not knowing how to run the system. It's at what level, if people want the building cooler in the summer or warmer in the winter than the original design criteria, it's going to cost more to operate the system. It's that simple. And if you leave the lights on all night because it makes the building look pretty, why, you're going to run up the electrical bill.
Imagine that.
Imagine that. Well, what's the next question, Al?
All right, well, let me see if I can get this to work here. Okay, Matt, on to the fifth and final question. See if we can get 100% participation here in the time that we've got.
Well, not all of our people belong to AIA, David.
Yes. Okay, so we're asking for those of you members of AIA and everybody else, what does the Code of Ethics say? And so make sure you select all of them that you believe apply. All right, how are we doing? We must have given them too much to read, Lewis. This one is a slower response time. Or they had to think about this one more deeply. I don't know. Okay, a couple seconds more. We've sort of settled down here. Yes, I wanted to at least get to 60%. Okay. All right. Good enough. So where do you think we are? Do you realize Code of Ethics for AIA requires every one of those statements that are the answers? So it requires architects to advocate for sustainable building and sites. It requires architects to advocate for sustainable buildings and communities. It requires use of sustainable practices. And it requires the architects not to materially alter the objectives of the owner without the owner's consent. So, and I put that last one in there primarily because if we have, as a point, if we have office policies as a design team to be able to promote green, sustainable design, and the owner is really not asking for it, the point here is that we have a duty under, if you're AIA members, to actually inform the owner and to obtain the owner's consent to be able to go ahead and produce a project that is a sustainable design if that was not part of the owner's original project requirements. So one of the things as an independent specifier that I usually am doing when I get the lead checklist, the very first question after I glance through the checklist to see what credits they're trying to achieve, what is the strategy? How do you plan to get there? How do you think you're going to be able to meet this objective?
Before you leave the poll results, I have to read to you our good friend Holly Robinson's response. Holly is a independent specifications consultant. She says, "Thank God I'm not an architect." And Ken Hersenberg asks, how does AIA define sustainable design? And I think that's an excellent question.
That would be it, yes. And I don't know that there is a definition. There's not that I recall, I don't believe there's a discussion in the Code of Ethics about what that constitutes, but they do use the term throughout the Code of Ethics. So it might be a good question to go back to AIA and look, and I hadn't thought to do that. Thanks for the suggestion, Ken.
The definition that I like of sustainability is the being able to meet the needs of this generation without endangering the ability of future generations to meet their needs. But that's not necessarily what other people think it means.
Yeah, and that's more at a global
Yes, and that's a very high level definition, not a tactical definition that you can actually use on a practical day-to-day basis. All right, well, tell us about this slide.
Well, what I'm trying to do is get to what are we doing to meet the owner's project requirements, and what is the strategy that we're going to use? How are we going to identify it? Because if we're really looking at some of these sustainable design programs, much of the materials credits are actually based on product costs. And when the design team selects individual credits to try to achieve them, have they really looked at and estimated the project and estimated the product costs to be able to know how they're going to go about getting a particular credit? One of the examples I used for this is we had a 4-story type 5A residential construction. 5A, did you get that? 5A, completely wood frame construction.
Okay.
And the design team decided that they were going to get the recycled product credits at the highest level. So looking at the project and knowing that generally you need something like a structural steel frame, and you probably need lots of concrete, and you need masonry to be able to get some high recycled content for high dollar value products within the project, the first question is, how are you going to do that in wood frame? You've lost all the concrete, you have no structural steel, and virtually you have no masonry except for the stair enclosures.
And there's not a lot of recycled wood that you can use.
I haven't found it yet, so and when you ask questions like that and you look at the design selections for these credits, sometimes you just get sort of a dumbfounded look as to, well, of course we're going to get it, and it's going to be up to the contractor to find a way to make it happen. And I think that that's very short-sighted on the design team if that's the approach that we're trying to take, because this has got to be written into the construction documents where it turns into a contract requirement, and if the contractor can't meet it, is he in default of contract? He may be. Is the architect causing a condition where the contractor actually cannot meet the contract? And what kind of implications does that have for the architect? So as a result, what we tend to see a lot of is the design team looking for that credit cushion. So if we're trying to hit a particular LEED certification level, they're looking to identify enough credits over and above the requirement in case one of them cannot be met, or two of them, or three of them cannot be met. And I would suggest that that causes some additional risk for the owner, because now they're paying for, if we're playing the credit game, they're paying for credits that are simply there to cushion what the design team may not have determined is really possible, and they're relying on the contractor to somehow figure it out. So what I would suggest is we need to be maybe a little bit more diligent than I see from my perspective, and advise the owner on what all of the alternatives are, and bring the owner into some of these discussions to make sure that everybody is on board and knows where the design is going and where some of these hidden risks lie. So I would ask everybody that's listening, what sort of efforts do you make to make sure that you're actually going to meet all the credits as a design team? How are you going to get there? So Louis, how do you take and turn all of this into construction documents, and how do we get to that end?
Well, I know our teams, when our teams are designing projects that have a specific sustainability goal, usually LEED, but it might be green globes. They do, in fact, sit down very, very early, sometimes even before they start sketching on what the thing is going to look like, and try to figure out in advance what goals they want the design to meet and what are practical to try to achieve. And so that first bullet, to identify what's achievable, what's practical, both from a cost viewpoint and from just general can-doableness.
Is that a word?
I just made it up.
Okay.
And so to develop this a strategy that informs the design on the front end, rather than trying to do it, have a design and then come up with a strategy to justify the design.
So, and part of the design team responsibility is certainly documenting the required construction credits through the specifications and the drawings, but they also have a responsibility to document all the design compliance, because you look at the sustainable design programs, there are certain credits that fall squarely on the shoulders of the design team, and there are other credits that fall more directly on the contractor team. If the design team fails in its efforts to actually achieve all of the design-related credits, it's going to put more stress on the construction team to step up its game to ensure that all of the construction credits are met. So we need to be aware that we can't really fall down in any of these aspects and expect the project to be able to be delivered meeting the owner's expectations. And I have down here on the bottom, these goals do not equal requirements. And one of the biggest complaints I have in how some of the sustainable design programs are specified is oftentimes they're specified as a goal. And goals are not really enforceable as a contract requirement. So if the goal is 90 and the contractor got 88, can you enforce the 90? If it's a goal, I would suggest that you can't. If it's a contract requirement, you can.
We had a couple of comments. Thomas Smith wonders about our good friend Tommy from Memphis. Asks, doesn't the AIA Code of Ethics increase the architect's professional liability with these rather grandiose commitments?
Good question, Tommy. I don't know. I would guess that it would depend upon whether or not you agree to a contractual requirement to deliver a sustainable design meeting a particular goal or meeting a particular credit. That would definitely increase the liability.
And that is an issue, and the number of lawsuits against architects and engineers for disappointing energy performance is a growth industry. So be careful, friends and neighbors, what you promise, because you may not be able to deliver. A couple of other comments here, David. William Vernon says they usually start with a rating goal and then review feasible credits for the project, then review what credits are feasible in the budget, and then establish design criteria. Pushback becomes designing to a checklist. And he asks, how can it be a requirement for a third party that neither the contractor nor the design professional and not the owner can control or influence? And obviously, that's you've hit the nail on the head, William. That's something that can't be controlled. You can't. We can write all the nifty stuff we want in the specs, but if it's not possible for the if we're asking for someone else to do it other than the contractor, it ain't necessarily going to happen.
Yes, and that goes back to, are you going to sign the agreement that requires it as a contract requirement?
Or just merely as a goal, and we slap each other on the back when we meet it.
Yes.
What's in it for me?
Okay, so I think we're down to our last slide, and we're just about on the hour here, Louis. So.
And Scott Anderton points out beating up on the contractor generally costs money. Most contractors are very careful with their agreements. And that's absolutely true, Scott. Years ago, I bought and read the Contractor's Guide to Change Orders. I cheated. I read the opposing team's playbook.
And they willingly published it and sold it to you, too. So they're making money on both ends.
Well, actually, it was a construction lawyer, Andrew Civitello, who wrote that. And incidentally, folks, that's still in print. So you might want to borrow a copy from the library or see if it's available on Amazon. Andrew Civitello, The Contractor's Guide to Change Orders.
Okay, so the last slide here, the construction team responsibility, just to understand that once we establish green criteria, that it dramatically affects the purchasing strategy for the contractor, because he really does have, in the materials credits, has to balance what he's doing. I mean, if we're trying to get a particular, say, a regional material, and perhaps a regional material with recycled content, is he actually able to get the material and meet both credits? Does he have a subcontractor that has a purchasing agreement with a local distributor that's able to find the right material to be able to meet the credits? Can he get a competitive bid and know that both bids are going to meet the criteria for both credits? It's an issue. We had a particular project where the architect, in this case, was insistent that we were going to get recycled gypsum board and regional gypsum board. The project happened to be in Rhode Island, and if you're familiar with the United States and you look at Rhode Island, the 500-mile radius, at least 2/3 of it is Pacific Ocean. So
Atlantic Ocean.
Atlantic. I'm sorry, it's the wrong coast.
Rhode Island.
Yeah, Atlantic Ocean. So I'm not familiar with Rhode Island. So it is the ocean, regardless which one. So you have very limited choice as to where you can go for regional materials, and when you put recycled content on top of it, there is no gypsum plant anywhere within that 500-mile radius that can deliver recycled content. So there you go. How do you balance it?
David, we're right up. We're a little past the hour, and we're going to need to wrap up. But Dave Metzger asks a really, really good question that I'd like to know the answer to. He asks, do jurisdictions that require LEED certification require such certification as a condition precedent to issuing a certificate of occupancy?
I don't know that answer.
Does anybody know?
Dave, do you know? So, yeah, and I have a mouse here in the background telling me that the certification wouldn't come until well after occupancy in most cases, by the time all the documentation is submitted.
Rosa Cheney suggests that typically there's a bond involved and the owner does not get the bond back if they do not get the certification. Oh, it's a money-raising scheme.
Okay. All right.
We need to wrap up, pal.
With that, we're back to the beginning. Thanks. That was a good note to end on. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining.
Thank you very much, Rosa.
And as the reminder, next month we're a little bit farther into the month, October 6th, first Thursday. We will be talking about flooring slip resistance. This is the one we had planned for August, and we've postponed it to October. So nobody has missed that program, and it's really one of the things that are sort of front of mind anymore. A lot of industry discussion about that topic.
And we have a true expert, not just David and me. We're looking forward to learning as much as the rest of you folks from this wonderful speaker.
All right. Join us next week, next month. Thank you, and hope to see some of you at Construct next week.
And keep the cards and letters coming in, friends and neighbors.